Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. One of our Patreon supporters, Jackson Green, recently asked the question, why didn't the Separatist Droid Army use the BX Commando series droids in larger numbers? Which is a pretty interesting question. Now, to the layperson, the BX series droid commando, upon first glance, weren't all that different from the B1 series battle droids. Both battle units came from Bactoid Armor Workshop. They had similar silhouettes and were both 6 feet 3 inches tall. Both droid models utilized the Bactoid E5 blaster rifle and were flexible enough to also pilot and operate a wide range of vehicles and larger weapons fielded by the Separatist Droid Army. Just judging their basic stats and their functions, you would think that these two models were interchangeable. But take a closer look at these two droids and immediately you'll notice some major differences. And it all starts with the heft of these two droids. The B1 battle droid is only 65 kilos in weight, and the BX series Commando droid is 85 kilos in weight, which means it's 20 kilos heavier, or roughly the weight of a majestic American bison at birth. We need to weaponize these things against the Dolphins. They are the natural equalizer to the evil that comes from the depths. So anyway, the additional weight reveals something special about the BX series. These Commando droids have much more powerful limbs and motivators, which allow the BX series to move at an exceptionally fast speed that no organic being could keep up with. Unless they're a Jedi, of course. This is why the BX series droid likes to carry vibro swords as a secondary. It's athletic enough to dodge enemy rounds and fast enough to close the gap in between it and its enemies. Absolutely terrifying for any clone trooper unlucky enough to get caught fighting one of these guys at close quarter ranges. The other additional weight comes in the form of titanium armor, which protects the torso of the BX series. This armor can take several rounds center mass from a DC-15A carbine before failing. The BX units also featured more advanced programming that allowed them to take on a variety of special roles as scouts, snipers, and even infiltration units. Equipped with advanced vocabulators, the BX series could mimic voices and even pretend to be a droid. As you can see, these droids were a serious threat, much more so than the B1 series, which were known as, quite weak and slow. The BX series droid commandos were properly built war machines that take full advantage of a mechanical platform's increased strength and endurance. The BX series makes the clone troopers, as elite as they are, seem slow and incompetent as a result. As a matter of fact, in most major deployments where the BX series battle droids were used against the clones, they seemed to completely dominate their clone counterparts. They were simply too fast and their tactics too aggressive even for a seasoned unit to counter. And because clone survival rates against the BX series commando droids were quite low, it meant that units rarely survived long enough against them to develop new tactics to counter them. Now, the only major problem with the BX series commando droid was its cost, at 17,900 credits per unit. Now, that might not seem so expensive. It's definitely cheaper than what it costs to train and outfit a clone, but compare that to a B1 series battle droid, which reportedly costs anywhere from 1 to 2,000 credits, and that's a big difference. That means for the price of one BX series commando droid, you could build, anywhere from 9 to 18 B1 series battle droids. Which leads us to a question, is one BX series commando droid really better than an entire squad of B1s? Now, these BX series battle droids weren't just a late war addition that the Separatist Droid Army created in a last-ditch effort to stop the Republic during the Outer Rim sieges. The BX series droids were seen in battles as early as 22 BBY, the first year of the Clone Wars. And there was even a BX series droid we see during Jedi Survivor that claims to have been active 5 cycles before the Clone Wars even started, which gives us a hint that these units were already in full development before the war started. Now, unlike the B1s, who have a lineage that dates back to the blockade of Naboo, the BX series didn't have nearly as much field testing, and were still considered relatively new platforms. And with any kind of new war machine, you're going to want to carefully deploy them in different stages. First in more controlled settings where you can test their capabilities, and then in gradually more and more difficult and uncontrolled settings. At the start of the Clone Wars, there was really no shortage in these types of testing grounds. Now, who made the actual decision on whether to deploy the BX series commando droids is an equally as important question. Even though the Sith via Darth Tyrannus and Darth Sidious basically ran both sides of the Clone Wars and ultimately had the ability to do whatever they wanted, there needed to be an illusion of power sharing to keep the Confederacy of Independent Systems kind of united and functioning properly. So when it came to smaller picture issues like the procurement of weapon systems for the war, the Sith tended to be a bit more hands-off. Count Dooku, the head of state, like Palpatine, always enjoyed using proxies and allies in legislature to get things done rather than using his own executive privileges.
In accordance with the bylaws of independent systems, a voice vote is required.
Dooku was always careful to avoid the label of being a dictator. He always wanted to maintain this image that the CIS was a functional democracy.
All in favor of initiating peace negotiations with the Galactic Republic, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed,
Nay.
Nay!
The ayes have it.
He wanted to facilitate this image that the Confederacy was somehow different from the Republic, something that a lot of people in the Senate, in the Separatist Parliament, ate up and believed.
This is a democracy, and unlike the Republic, corporations do not rule us.
The truth was, Dooku didn't really care what the Separatist Parliament said. He was, in fact, a dictator.
This is quite troubling. Your own Senate voting to end the war?
I assure you, gentlemen, your worries are gravely exaggerated.
How can you be sure this groundswell of peace won't continue? Where is the attack we were promised?
And so these shadowy industrial tycoons, heads of major banks, industrial manufacturing, and transport companies in the Outer Rim, were the real individuals who held all the power in the Confederacy. Or so they thought. Such were the layers of power that the Sith created in the Confederacy that it was actually quite confusing to see who was in charge of what. Now, the Executive Separatist Council did have some powers, far more than the Separatist Parliament, and that's because they controlled the economic might of the Separatist movement, and also had huge operations working with the Republic. They're kind of double dipping. These individuals definitely had a say in what kind of droids the Army was procuring and in what numbers. Newt Gunray and Wat Tambor, along with Poggle the Lesser, were all directly involved in manufacturing and deploying units like the B1 and BX series. And the thing they were concerned about more than anything was,
we need fighting to feed the machine and our profits.
now, waging a war is extremely expensive, even if you are funneling subsidies and government contracts into the companies controlled by the Separatist Council. That's because they were also responsible for funding the treasury for the Separatist Alliance. So they're essentially paying themselves to build droids. This is why programs like the B1 battle droid were so cheap. One tends to cut a discount to oneself. Now, Count Dooku did create policies that essentially pillaged Outer Rim worlds for all of their wealth and credits in order to fund this war. But the Separatists simply didn't have enough resources to continue fighting against the vastly larger and more populous Republic. The Republic could afford to spend 1 million credit per clone trooper if necessary to fight this war. The financial and economic centers were all based in the core. You had tens of thousands of years of wealth concentrated in the center of the galaxy. The Outer Rim corporations were all rising stars. They were new money. They hadn't acquired the same type of wealth, and could only compete by producing extremely cheap battle units to stand a chance against the Republic's might. This is why in the last year of the war, there was a huge effort to nationalize the banking system by Palpatine. Essentially, the banking system was on the verge of collapsing after giving so many terrible loans, with no hope of repayment to the Separatist Alliance. Now, at the beginning of the war, the Separatist Droid Army was dominating the Republic, and so there was no incentive really to create more advanced droid programs like the BX series Commando droids and roll them out in larger numbers, especially when the B1 battle droids seemed to be doing a good enough job. However, there were more parties involved when it came to deciding what kind of droids would be deployed in the Separatist Droid Army. Another individual who had a lot of say in the matter was General Grievous. The cyborg general was one of the most feared and effective battlefield commanders in the entire Separatist Alliance, and given the rank of Supreme Marshal Commander of the Separatist Droid Army. He would be directly responsible for testing and selecting the type of battle droids he wanted to be deployed on the battlefield. His decisions and insight were ran by the Executive Council, and he had a significant sway over the makeup of the Droid Army. Although ultimately, the budget had to be approved by the Separatist Council, who all jealously guarded their credits. If Dooku or Grievous just ripped the credits out of their hands, it would disrupt the illusion of this careful balance of powers between Dooku and his Executive Council, and that would be a problem. But still, Grievous, after a very positive initial assessment of the BX series Commando droids, managed to convince the Separatist Council to approve a limited production of these droids. Roughly 12,000 BX series Commando droids would be built in the famed Akiva production plant. Now, as far as the lore goes, this is the only batch of BX series Commando droids that we know that were built. This is the only factory where they were built, and basically this factory was destroyed late in the Clone Wars during the Battle of Akiva. But I'm almost certain that this wasn't the only batch of BX series droids or the only factory that produced them. But still, these were pretty specialized battle droids that were probably only made in specific factories that were tooled to build them. And I think considering the penny-pinching nature of the Separatist Council, the compromise that was made was that Grievous would deploy these units as special forces. Again, the only way that much poorer and smaller Confederacy independent systems could maintain an advantage, and more importantly pose a significant threat to the Republic, therefore allowing Palpatine to slowly erode the institutions of democracy, was by deploying a massive army of B1s that were roughly the price of a clone DC-15 blaster rifle. And so the limited production run of the BX series Commando droids were really created out of economic necessity. So what were the total numbers of BX Commando droids fielded by Grievous and the Separatist Droid Army? Well, let's take a look at the numerically inferior Grand Army of the Republic, and you'll see that the GAR only produced around 10,000 Republic Commandos at the beginning of the war. We're unsure if these numbers were replenished with additional battalions, or only replacement units were made, although some normal clones were also promoted into Commando units. The Republic Commandos had a similar role to the BX series Commando droids, and so it makes me think that having 12,000 BX series Commando droids isn't that crazy of an idea. You could spread them out into, a dozen different legions or battalions and have them deployed in various theaters of battle. I mean, the BX series Commando droid do seem to deploy in larger numbers than the clone commandos, which squads consisted of only 4 members. The BX series Commando droids are also far more disposable than the clone commandos, despite what happened to them during the Battle of Geonosis. At most, I expect the Separatist Droid Army never had more than, say, 100,000 of these BX series Commando droids in action at any time of the war. And during the Outer Rim Siege, I'm sure their numbers shrank as supply chains got cut off and it became harder to produce these more advanced units. Even if the Separatist Droid Army had switched out the B1s for BX Commando droids and fielded a much smaller army as a result, we still have to remember that ground forces were only a small part of the battlefield equation and mainly used for garrison duties, something that the B1 battle droid could do relatively well. The BX Commandos didn't really have a significant advantage in a static defense role, and both the B1s and the BXs were equally vulnerable to larger war machines, air, and space assets. And so, guys, I hope this video gives you more insight in what the Separatist High Council were thinking when they deployed the BX series Commando droids. I think increasing their numbers slightly, as our Patreon supporter Jackson Green mentioned in his question, is probably the best way to go, allowing for more special forces units and assets to be deployed and, giving smaller units access to these deadly battle droids. These BX Commando droids were definitely very effective on the battlefield. They just weren't cost effective enough for, essentially was a much smaller faction. I think people oftentimes forget how small the Separatist Alliance was and how few resources they actually had compared to the core of the galaxy. And so I would say that the amount of BX Commando droids that the Separatist Droid Army deployed was pretty reasonable. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. My name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.